Barbara and Brittany. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 1 of Barbara and Brittany by E. A. Gillie. Aunt Anne. Barbara entered the nursery with rather a worried look on her face. "Aunt Anne is coming tomorrow, children," she announced. "Tomorrow!" exclaimed a fair-haired boy, rising from the window-seat. "Oh, I say, Barb, that's really rather hard lines. In the holidays, too." "Just as we were preparing to have a really exciting time," sighed Frances, who was her brother's close companion and ally. "I know it's a little hard," Barbara said consolingly, sitting down beside them and taking one of the twins on her lap, while the other leaned up against her. "But you will all try to be good and nice to her, won't you? She went away with a bad opinion of us last time, and it worries Mother. Besides, we mustn't forget that she was Father's sister." "I can't think how she ever came to be," sighed Frances. "She's so dreadfully particular, and we always seem naughtier when she's here. But we'll make an effort, Barbara." "And you won't run away as soon as she speaks to you, Lucy?" Barbara went on, looking at the little girl in her lap. "It's rude, you know. You must try to talk nicely when she wants you to." "Yes," and the child nodded. "Only she does seem to make a lot of concussions when she comes." "You mean discussions," Donald corrected. "You shouldn't use words you don't understand, Lucy. But I must agree with you. I know she always raises my corruption." "What?" gasped Barbara. "Raises my corruption," repeated her brother. "That's a good old Scottish expression that I've just found in a book, and it means makes you angry." "Well, don't use it before Aunt Anne, there's a dear," Barbara urged, getting up. "She thinks we use quite enough queer expressions as it is." "I'll speak like a regular infant prodigy. But surely you're not going yet? You've just come." "I must help to get things ready for Aunt Anne," Barbara said gaily, for she had recovered her spirits since procuring the children's promise of good behaviour. "I'll come to you later." "Barbara is really rather an angel," remarked Donald after she had gone. "It's not many sisters would slave in the house, instead of having another maid, to let a fellow go to a decent school." "You're quoting Mother," Frances replied, hanging out of the window in a dangerous position. "But of course it's true. If I only had time I'd write a fascinating romance about her." "I'll read every page of it, and buy 100 copies," her brother promised gallantly. But, as he knew that there was nothing Frances hated more than writing, he felt pretty safe. "Of course," he pursued, "Aunt Anne thinks Mother spoils us. I don't quite think that. It's just that she's so nice and sympathetic with us when we're naughty, and Aunt Anne doesn't understand that. But still, to please Barb, and as we've promised, we must try to be respectable and good this time. Remember, twins." The twins were not noted for long memories, but their intentions were good, and the first day of Aunt Anne's visit passed very well, the children remembering to rub their feet on the mat, shut the door softly, and not fidget at meals. But the exertion seemed too much for them, and the second day began rather boisterously, and did not improve as it went on. After lunch, when the twins came into the drawing-room, Lucy drew a footstool near her aunt, and sat down meekly upon it, thinking that the sooner Aunt Anne began to talk the sooner it would be over. Aunt Anne was feeling almost as much embarrassed by the presence of so many children as they were by that of their aunt, but her sense of duty was strong, and she began to make conversation with the one nearest her, who happened to be Lucy. "What are you doing in lessons now, Lucy?" Lucy looked solemn. "Chiefly history," she said. Frances laughed. "It's only stories," she exclaimed, "that Barbara tells her and Dick." "It's a history," repeated Lucy indignantly, "isn't it, Dick? It's all about England." "I should have thought writing was more suitable for a little girl like you." Frances opened her mouth to retort, but caught a warning glance from Barbara and subsided. Then conversation languished and Lucy looked across longingly at her sister, to see if she had done her duty. But not being able to catch her eye, she sighed, and supposing she had not yet fulfilled her part, cast about in her mind for something else to say. "Do you live far from here?" she began suddenly, staring at her aunt. "Quite a long way," Miss Britton replied. "In Wales. Perhaps you know where that is?" "Oh, yes!" exclaimed Lucy, rising in her excitement. "It's where the ancient Britons were sent. Barbara told us about them. Oh, please, Aunt Anne, aren't you an ancient Briton?" Aunt Anne smiled grimly. "No, I am not. They lived in quite the olden times, and were clothed in skins." "But are you sure?" pressed the child. It's just the skins seem wanting. They were driven into Wales, and surely you're a Briton and come from the olden times. You're really quite ancient, aren't you, Aunt Anne?" Barbara was thankful her aunt laughed, but she was not so glad that Donald and Frances found their laughter so irrepressible that they had to resort to the sofa cushions, and when the twins were dismissed a little later by Mrs. Britton, she was rather relieved to see them follow. But from that moment the spirit of hilarity seemed to have fallen upon all the children, and Barbara looked regretfully at the falling rain, and wondered how she should keep them occupied for the rest of the day, for it was just the beginning of the holidays, when they were usually allowed a good deal of liberty. She knew by the noise that presently sounded from upstairs that they had begun hide and seek, and she read disapproval of the uproar in her aunt's face, and went upstairs to suggest something else. The children good-temperedly betook themselves to soap bubbles, Frances consenting to fetch the tray to keep things tidy, if Donald would take it back, and Barbara left them, congratulating herself that they were safely settled over something quiet. It was, therefore, surely an evil fate that made Aunt Anne begin to go upstairs later in the afternoon, just as Donald was descending rapidly with the tray, not in his hand. "I'm so sorry," he said, getting up in dismay after his rapid slide. "What a comfort that I didn't knock you over! But it's so much the quickest way of bringing a tray down. Have you ever tried it?" If he had not been considerably agitated he would not have asked such a foolish question, and perhaps if Aunt Anne had really not got a severe fright she would not have been so much annoyed. But as it was, she stalked past him without saying a word and went up to her room. "There," he said ruefully, "I've done it, and I really did mean to be good." The incident subdued them all considerably, and Barbara hoped that now they might get to the end of the visit without any further mishaps. But next morning at breakfast that hope was banished, for her aunt came downstairs with such an expression of annoyance upon her face that every one knew something really unpleasant was coming. "Is anything wrong?" Mrs. Britton asked anxiously. "Did you not sleep well? Or surely the children did not annoy you in any way?" Visions of apple pie beds were floating before her mind, although the children's looks of innocence somewhat reassured her on that point. "Some one has annoyed me considerably," Aunt Anne said coldly, "by interfering with my clothes. When I came to put on my blue blouse this morning, I found that every other one of the silver buttons had been cut off." There was a gasp of astonishment, and Barbara was just about to scorn the notion that any of the children could have been concerned in the matter, when her eyes fell on Dick's face. Miss Britton was looking in the same direction. "I should think that little boy knows something about it," she said. "Dick!" Mrs. Britton exclaimed, for he was usually the least apt of the three to get into mischief. "Dick, what did you do it for? Tell us why you did it," Barbara questioned eagerly, and the little boy was just about to reply when Miss Britton spoke again. "I should think he had no reason at all, except wanton mischief. Perhaps he used the buttons for marbles. There cannot be any real reason for such a silly deed, though he may make one up. Well, why did you do it?" Barbara saw the obstinate expression that they dreaded creeping over the little boy's face at her aunt's words, and knew that now they would probably get nothing satisfactory from him, but she was not quite prepared for the answer that came so defiantly. "I did it for ornament, of course." There was a silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Britton sent the little boy to the nursery to stay there until he was sent for. "I'm so sorry, Anne," she said in distress. "I cannot think what has made him do it." "It is just the result of your upbringing. I always said you were absurdly indulgent to the children." Then, because Barbara was sure that Dick had had some other reason that would perhaps have explained his action, and because she saw tears in her mother's eyes, and knew how lonely and tired she often felt, and how anxious about the welfare of the children and the care of the house, she turned wrathfully upon her aunt. "You have no right to criticise mother like that, Aunt Anne, and of course she knows a great deal more about bringing up children than you do. If you had not interfered, Dick would have given the proper reason, and certainly if we do what we shouldn't it's our fault, not mother's." At this there were confirmatory nods from the children, who continued to gaze in startled but admiring astonishment at Barbara, whose politeness was usually their example, and whom they hardly recognised in this new role. They awaited, they knew not what, from their aunt, but except for a horrified cry of "Barbara!" from Mrs. Britton, the girl's outburst was received in silence, her aunt merely shrugging her shoulders and continuing her breakfast. The children finished theirs in uncomfortable silence, then slipped quietly away. "Well," Donald said ruefully, when Frances and he had climbed into the apple tree, where they usually discussed matters of importance, "she did look fine, didn't she? But I'm afraid she's done it now. Aunt will clear out soon enough, I should think, and Barb will be just as sorry as can be to have flared out like that at a guest, and father's sister too." In that last supposition Donald was quite right, for Mrs. Britton needed to say nothing to make Barbara feel very ashamed of herself. But in his conclusion about his aunt he was quite wrong, for to the children's astonishment Miss Britton showed no signs of speedy departure. Indeed, later in the day, the children felt honesty demanded they must own her to be rather a brick, for she accepted Barbara's apology with good grace, and said that though of course she had been rude, she would not deny that there had been some provocation, and that if Barbara could find out anything more from Dick, she would be glad to hear of it. It was then, after much manoeuvring, that the girl got to the truth of the matter, which Dick related with tears. He had taken the buttons for mother, he said. When he was out with her the other day they had looked for quite a long time at some other beautiful silver ones, and when he asked his mother why she did not buy them, she had said that she had not enough money just then. They were very like the kind on Aunt Anne's blouse, and having noticed that she did not use half of them to button it up, Dick had not seen any reason why they should be left on, although he had meant to tell her what he had done immediately after breakfast. Miss Britton accepted the explanation, and said she thought there was no need for the culprit to be punished this time, and she hoped he would have more sense soon. But about Barbara she had something more of importance to communicate. "In my opinion," she said, in a manner that inferred she expected her advice to be taken, "the girl is much too young to have finished her education, boys or no boys, and I am thinking of sending her to France for a time, to learn more of the language and see something of the world. It is not good for a girl of her age to have so much responsibility." Now, it had been Barbara's dream to go abroad, but after the first gasp of delight and astonishment she grew grave, and said she was afraid she could not leave her mother and the children. "Fiddlesticks!" Aunt Anne replied, without allowing Mrs. Britton time to speak. "You are far too young, my dear, to imagine yourself of such importance in the world. I will send a good old-fashioned nurse that I know of to take your place, and it will be good for the children to have a stricter regime than yours has been for a while." Even if Aunt Anne had been accustomed to have her words disregarded, which she was not, Mrs. Britton would not have needed much persuasion to make her fall in with the proposal, for she had often grieved in private over the fact that, since her husband's death, Barbara's education had had to suffer that Donald's might advance. And now, though she wondered how she would get on without her eldest daughter, she was only too thankful to have such an opportunity thrown in her way. "I cannot think why I never interfered before," Miss Britton said, "but it is better late than never, and we will have as little delay now as possible." In a few days the children were all as busy as bees helping to get Barbara ready. They assisted in choosing her new frocks and hats, and the style of making, and poor Miss Smith, who came to sew for her, was nearly distracted by their popping in every now and then to see how she was getting on. Even Donald, who hated talking about girls' fashions, bought a paper, because he saw it had a pattern of a blouse advertised, and he thought it might be useful. The family were very curious to hear with whom she was going to France and where she was going to be, for Aunt Anne had undertaken to make all the arrangements, and it certainly was a slight shock to the children when she wrote to say she had made up her mind to go herself for a fortnight to Paris before sending Barbara off to Brittany, where she had found a most suitable place for her in the house of 2 maiden ladies who took in people wanting to learn French. Donald whistled when Mrs. Britton read that out. "Fancy a fortnight with Aunt Anne, and then the 2 maiden ladies! Chiggers!" That was a favourite expression of his. "You'll be worried out of your life, Barb." The worst of it was, that Aunt Anne, who had not been abroad for many years, said she was going to let Barbara manage the journey and the sightseeing in Paris, and sent her a guide-book to read up everything of interest. She said she was doing this to give her niece experience, and prepare her for being by herself later on, but Donald declared she wanted to see what kind of stuff she was made of, and that if Barbara did not do things well, she would scoff at her greatly for thinking she could manage a house and children, while she could not succeed in finding her way about France. "But I know the old lady, and we'll just show her you're our sister, and before we've done you'll know that guide-book from cover to cover," he assured her. They had only a week left, for Aunt Anne was very rapid in her decisions and plans, but they studied the guide-book morning, noon, and night. It was most instructive holiday work, Donald said, and when Barbara had not time to read it, Frances and he read for her and poured their knowledge into her ears at meal times. They learned what coloured omnibus went to the different parts of Paris, and on what day different buildings were open, and by the end of the week they all felt they could personally conduct tours all over Paris. It was rather hard when the last day came, because they knew that the house would seem horribly empty without Barbara. The two little ones were on the verge of crying all the afternoon, and Frances had to be very stern, while Donald rose to flights of wit hitherto undreamed of, to keep up every one's spirits. Of course the two elder ones knew it would be hardest on them after Barbara left, because some of her responsibility would fall on their shoulders. But they were quite determined that she should have a cheerful send-off next morning, so they bribed the children with promises of sweets if they did not cry, and they succeeded in giving her quite a hilarious good-bye at the station. After the train had gone, however, and they turned homewards, Frances felt that if she had not promised Barbara to help her mother, she would have hidden herself in the attic and cried, although that would have been so horribly babyish for a girl of 12 that she knew she would have felt ashamed of herself afterwards, though perhaps her pillow could have told tales of a grief confided to it that the gay-hearted Frances did not usually indulge in. End of Chapter 1. Read by Sibella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Of Barbara and Brittany by E. A. Gillie. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 2. Number 14, Rue Saint-Sulpice. Meanwhile, Barbara and her aunt pursued their journey, and in due time arrived at Newhaven, where the first thing they were told was that the tide was unusually low at Dieppe, which would prevent them entering that harbour, and therefore they were not going to leave Newhaven for another hour and a half. Aunt Anne gazed in indignation upon their informant, and declared it was scandalous that a boat, timed to leave at a certain hour, should be so irregular and unpunctual, whereupon the captain, shrugging his shoulders, said that the lady should complain to the moon about the tides rather than to him. They managed to fill in the time very well with lunch, however, and after a little grumbling, Aunt Anne resigned herself to fate, though she was glad enough when they finally steamed out of the harbour. Miss Britton was not a very good sailor, and in preparation for the voyage, as she called the crossing, she had accumulated great stores of knowledge as to how to treat sea-sickness. She established herself on the upper deck, let down a deck-chair as low as it would go, and replacing her hat by a weird little tam-o'-shanter, covered her eyes with a handkerchief. "To avoid sea-sickness, Barbara," she said, "you must lie as flat as possible, keep the eyes closed, and breathe in correspondence with the ship's motion. Though," she added, "I really cannot tell at present which is its motion. Perhaps there will be more when we get farther out." Barbara chuckled, but deferred making similar preparations until the motion was more defined, for she was much too interested in what was going on around her to close her eyes to it all. Aunt Anne asked her at intervals if it was getting rougher, for though her niece assured her there were no signs of such a thing, she did not venture to sit up until they were quite near Dieppe. "Oh, Aunt!" Barbara exclaimed joyfully, "just look at all the officials in their high-peaked hats. Don't they look nice, so Frenchy and foreign?" "You would hardly expect them to look English," Aunt Anne returned dryly, and began to gather together her belongings preparatory to leaving the boat. "It is some time since I have been in France, Barbara," she exclaimed, "having been quite contented with our own beautiful land. But I remember it was best to be very quick in going to the trains, so as to get good seats. Follow me closely, child." Barbara obediently did as she was told, and having got safely through the troubles of the douane, they chose their carriage and proceeded to arrange their possessions. "My umbrella!" Aunt Anne cried suddenly, looking anxiously on the racks and under the seat. "Barbara, I must have left it on the boat. Why did you not remind me? You must run back for it now, but don't let the train go without you. Run, child, run!" Barbara expediently hurried away, and after a halting and somewhat lengthy explanation on the quay, was allowed to go on board again, and spied the missing umbrella on the deck. When she returned, the train had been moved higher up, and she could not distinguish the carriage anywhere. The guard was already beginning to wave the signal, and Barbara felt she was lost as a passenger, when a dark, stout little man dashed up to her and seized her by the arm. "Par ici," he cried. "Votre maman vous attend, mademoiselle." And they flew down the platform with the guard shouting warnings behind them. They were barely in time, and Barbara sunk panting into her seat. Fancy!" Aunt Anne cried indignantly. "Fancy getting lost like that! It just shows that you are not fit to look after children when you cannot manage an umbrella." Barbara was too breathless to reply and too much amused, perhaps, really to mind. The country was pretty enough, but it soon began to grow dusk, and they wondered when they would arrive in Paris. The train was due at 7:30, but there did not seem to be the least chance of getting in at that hour, for, late as they already were, they continued to lose time on the way. The little Frenchman was their only companion, and he did not seem to know much English. However, between his shreds of that language and Barbara's scanty French, she managed to find out that they would not arrive in Paris until midnight. Aunt Anne expressed her annoyance in no measured terms, but he merely shrugged his shoulders and smiled, until she collapsed into a corner speechless with disgust. He left them at Rouen, and Barbara, watching her aunt sleeping in a corner, wondered what they would do when they finally did arrive at the station. But as soon as the lights of the Gare de Lazare showed through the darkness, Miss Britton began to bestir herself, and when the train stopped, marched boldly out of the carriage as if she had been in Paris dozens of times. In a little while they were seated in a fiacre, going along through brightly lighted streets, feeling very satisfied that they were actually nearing their destination. But their content did not last long, for soon leaving the lighted thoroughfares, they turned into a dark road with high walls on either side, and just a lamp now and then. It really seemed rather lonely, and they both began to feel uncomfortable and to wonder if they were being taken to the wrong place. Stories of mysterious disappearances began to flit through Barbara's brain, and she started when Aunt Anne said in a very emphatic tone, "He looked a very nice cabman, quite respectable and honest." "Yes," Barbara said meekly, though she had hardly noticed him. "I knew it was some distance from the station, of course." "Yes," Barbara replied once more, and added, "Of course," as Miss Britton began to look rather fierce. "It was a little stupid of you not to think of proposing to stay in the station hotel while I was collecting the wraps," she went on rather sharply, and Barbara was trying to think of something soothing to say, when the cab drew up suddenly, and they were both precipitated on to the hat boxes on the other seat. Barbara put her hat straight, and looked out of the window. It certainly seemed to be a funny place to which they had come. The houses were high and narrow, and the one they had stopped at had a dirty archway without a single light, but as the driver showed no intention of getting down and ringing, Barbara stepped out and groped about for a bell or a knocker of some kind. Then the cabman, pointing with his whip up the archway, said, "Numero 14 par là." The girl did not much relish going into the darkness by herself, for she was sure there must be some mistake. But she was afraid that, if Miss Britton got out too, the man might drive away and leave them, so she begged her aunt to remain in the cab while she went into the archway to make inquiries. After some groping she found a bell rope, and rang 3 times without receiving any answer. She was just about to ring again, when she heard stealthy steps approaching the door, and the next moment it was opened, disclosing to her frightened gaze a dirty-looking man, wearing a red nightcap and carrying a candle in his hand. Barbara recoiled a step, for though she had been sure there was some mistake she had not expected anything as bad as this. However, she managed to gasp out, "Madame Belvoise?" and was intensely relieved to see the fellow shake his head, but he leered at her so horribly that she waited to make no more inquiries, but turned and fled back to the fiacre. "This is not the right place," she pouted, "and I'm thankful it isn't. There's such a horrid man." "A man? But she was a widow," Aunt Anne said vaguely, and her niece could not help laughing, for if that were the case there might have been brothers or sons. But the cabman was getting very impatient, and it was not an easy matter to argue with him, for when they insisted that this could not be No. 14 Rue St. Sulpice, he merely shook his head and persisted that it was. Then suddenly a light seemed to break upon him, and he asked, "14 Rue St. Sulpice? Courcelles?" Barbara shook her head violently, and said, "Non, non, Neuilly." Whereupon, with much grumbling and torrents of words, that perhaps it was well she did not understand, he whipped up his horse, and she had hardly time to scramble into the cab before they swung off. They were very glad to leave the neighbourhood, for they saw the red nightcap peeping out at the end of the archway, and it seemed as if there were more friends of the same kind in the rear. "It is most absurd for the man to think we should have been staying here. I think he must be mad." "Yes," returned Barbara, not knowing what else to say, and they continued to rumble over more cobble streets and down dark roads, till they finally stopped in a dimly lighted street, which, however, was broad and clean, with fairly large houses on either side. Barbara got out with some misgivings, wondering what their fate would be this time. She had to ring several times as before, but as there was no dark archway, and the cab was close by, she had not the same fear. When the door opened, she could distinguish nothing at first, but presently espied a little woman, in a white nightcap, holding a candle. "Dear me!" she thought, "candles and nightcaps seem to be the fashion here." But aloud merely asked politely for Madame Belvoir, hoping that she was not speaking to the lady in question. Before the portière, for it was she, could answer, a bright light shone out at the far end of the passage, and a girl came hurrying down, saying, "Madame Belvoir? Mais oui, entrez, entrez. C'est Mademoiselle Britton, n'est-ce pas?" Mademoiselle Britton was not a little relieved, and so, I am sure, was her poor aunt, who came hurrying out of the cab, and was so glad to get rid of it that she paid the 10 francs the man demanded without a murmur. The French girl explained in broken English that her mother greatly regretted being absent, having been called away suddenly to an uncle who was ill, but that she and her sister would do their utmost to make Miss Britton comfortable. By that time they had reached the end of the passage, and were led into a comfortable room, where another girl was waiting. Tea was ready for them too, and Barbara thought she had never appreciated it more. She tried to explain the reason of their late arrival, and told some of their adventures, but although both the French girls listened politely and smiled and nodded, Barbara thought that neither of them understood much of what she said. However, she did not mind that, and presently they were led the way upstairs into a room that was a haven of delight to the wanderers. The windows opened onto a garden, whence the scent of lilac floated, and the whole room, down to the hearth-brush which charmed Barbara, was decorated in blue. With the memory of that other Rue St. Sulpice still fresh in their minds, their present quarters indeed seemed delightful, and Barbara declared she could have fallen upon the necks of both girls and kissed them. "A quite unnecessary and most impertinent proceeding," Aunt Anne replied curtly. "They will much prefer pounds, shillings, and pence to embraces," and Barbara thought that after all she was probably right. End of Chapter 2. Read by Sibella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Barbara and Brittany by E. A. Gillie. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 3. A Nocturnal Adventure. It was very nice to waken the next morning and find the sunshine streaming in at the windows. Barbara was ready to be charmed with everything, from the pretty little maid in the mob cap, who carried in the breakfast, to the crisp rolls and coffee. Both of the travellers were quite rested, and eager to begin sightseeing, and Miss Britton left the choice of place to her niece. The latter diligently scanned the guide-book as she took her breakfast, and kept calling out fresh suggestions every few moments, but finally they determined on the Louvre as most worthy of their first visit. I do not know whether it was the experience of the night before, but Aunt Anne seemed to have a fixed idea that Paris was full of thieves, and before starting out she made the most careful preparations for encountering pickpockets. She sewed some of her money into a little bag inside her dress, put some more into a pocket in her underskirt, and said that Barbara might pay for things in general, as it would teach her the use of French money. She herself kept only a few centimes in a shabby purse of her dress pocket, to disappoint any thief who took it. As soon as the fiacre stopped in the court of the Louvre, they were besieged by several disreputable and seedy-looking men wanting to act as guides through the galleries. Partly to get rid of the rest, partly because they thought it might be easier, they engaged the tidiest-looking one who seemed to know most English, and, feeling rather pleased with themselves, entered the first gallery. Of course, Barbara wished to begin by seeing those pictures which she had heard most about, but the guide had a particular way of his own of taking people round, and did not like any interference. Indeed, he did not even like to let them stay longer than a few seconds at each picture, and kept chattering the whole time, till at last they grew annoyed, and Aunt Anne told him they would do the rest by themselves. But it took some time to get rid of him, and then he went sulkily, complaining that they had not given him enough, though Barbara felt sure that he had really got twice as much as was his due. They enjoyed themselves very much without him, and saw a great deal before lunch-time. At the end of the meal, when Aunt Anne was going to take out her purse to use the centimes in it for a tip for the waiter, she discovered her preparations had not been in vain, and that the purse had really been stolen. Perhaps on the whole she was rather glad, for she turned to Barbara in triumph. "There now, Barbara," she said, "if I had had my other purse in my pocket, it would have been just the same, and now whoever has it will be properly disappointed." They did not return to Neuilly until the evening, where they met the rest of the pension at dinner. Besides two brothers of the Belvoir family, there were a number of French visitors and one English family, to whom Miss Britton and her niece took an immediate dislike. The father, who, they were told, was a solicitor whose health had broken down, was greedy and vulgar, and his son and daughter were pale, frightened-looking creatures, who took no part in the gay conversation which the French kept up. After dinner, when every one else went into the salon for music, the solicitor and his children retired to their rooms, which Mademoiselle Belvoir and her brothers seemed to resent. The former confided to Barbara, in very quaint English, that they had never had such people in their house before, and Aunt Anne, who overheard the remark, shook her head sagely. "I would not trust them, mademoiselle." Miss Britton was English from the sole of her foot to the tip of her tongue. "They seem unpleasant, and I have a great power for reading faces." At which Mademoiselle Belvoir murmured something about wishing her mother were back. However, the evening was a pleasant one, though Barbara was so tired that she was hardly an intelligent listener to the music provided, and fell asleep as soon as her head touched the pillow. She was therefore a little surprised when she awoke suddenly 2 hours later for apparently no reason at all. She had been dreaming about something exciting, and lay trying to remember what it was, when an eerie feeling stole over her, and it seemed as if she heard breathing, which was not her aunt's, close beside her. She did not dare to move for a moment. Then she turned her head very gently, and between the two windows near the recess she was sure she saw a dark figure. The longer she watched, the surer she became, and she knew it could not be her aunt, whom she heard breathing quietly in the other bed. It was certainly a horrible sensation, and all the unpleasant stories she had ever read crowded into her mind. At first she could not think what to do, but at last made up her mind to go across the room to Miss Britton's bed and tell her. Yawning, and pretending to wake up gradually, though all the time she felt as if she had been lying there for hours, she called out, "Aunt Anne, I can't sleep, so I'm coming into your bed." Miss Britton awoke at once. She was a light sleeper, and at first I think she imagined her niece was mad. "If you can't sleep in your own bed," she said, "I'm quite sure you won't sleep in mine, for it's not big enough for two." But Barbara persisted, and at last her aunt gave way. "Well," she said at last, rather crossly, "be quick if you are coming. I don't want to be kept awake all night." The truth was, it seemed so horrible to cross the room close to that black figure, as she would have to do, that Barbara lingered a moment, screwing up her courage. It was hard, certainly, to walk slowly across, for she thought she should not run, feeling all the time as if two hands would catch hold of her in the darkness. She was very glad to creep in beside her aunt, and at first could not do anything but lie and listen to that lady's grumblings. Then, warning her not to scream, she whispered very softly that there was a man beside the window. Miss Britton took it wonderfully coolly, and after the first start said nothing for a few minutes. Then she remarked in loud, cheerful tones, "Well, child, as you are not sleepy, let us talk about our plans for tomorrow." They talked a long time, hoping that the man would give it up and go, but still the black figure stood there motionless. At last Barbara, who could bear it no longer, said, "Oh, aunt, since we can't sleep let us put on the light and read things in the guide-book." At that moment she heard a rustle behind, and saw the man try to get into the recess, but the trunks were there, and meeting that obstruction he turned and made a quick dash to the French window, and was out in a moment, whereupon Aunt Anne and Barbara sat up in bed and screamed. Then the girl leapt to the electric light, and her aunt to the bell, and in a few moments the maids and the Misses Belvoir came running in. "He's gone!" cried Barbara, looking out of the window and feeling quite brave now that so many people had arrived. "He's gone, and it was too dark to see his face." Aunt Anne, meanwhile, explained as well as she could what had happened, and the Misses Belvoir looked so frightened and worried that Barbara felt she must be a dreadful nuisance. But they were very nice and extremely apologetic, declaring that such a thing had never happened before, and that the police should be told in the morning, and their brothers would search the garden at once and sit outside the door all night if Miss Britton liked. But Aunt Anne, who had delightful common sense, said briskly, "Nonsense! Whoever it was, he will be too frightened to think of coming back tonight, so just go to your beds and let us get to ours." And she pushed them gently out. They continued to murmur apologies after the door was shut, but Aunt Anne paid not the least heed. "Now, my dear," she said, turning to Barbara, "I am sure you know that what I said to them is quite true, and that our friend will not return tonight. So be sensible, and go back to bed, and we will talk about it all in the morning." Of course, Barbara did as she was told, and though she was sure she would never get to sleep, strange to say, in a very little while she was dreaming peacefully, and did not waken till late next morning. End of Chapter 3. Read by Sibella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Barbara and Brittany by E. A. Gillie. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 4. The Man in Blue Glasses. The nocturnal adventure caused quite an excitement in the house, and very little else was talked of at lunch-time. Aunt Anne had asked Mademoiselle Belvoir if she would rather nothing was said about the affair, but the girl said it was impossible to keep it quiet, as several people had heard the bustle in the night, and were anxious to know all about it. So Miss Britton found that she and her niece were objects of general interest, and they both struggled nobly to describe the adventure intelligibly to the others, though Barbara knew that she got horribly mixed in her French tenses, and was not quite sure whether she understood all the questions the French people put to her. The solicitor annoyed her most, he was so superior. "Why did you not rush upon the fellow and scream for help?" he said. "I was far too frightened to do anything of the kind," Barbara answered indignantly. "I would never have dared fling myself upon a dark figure like that. If I had seen him, I shouldn't have minded so much." "So you did not see his face?" said the solicitor. "Of course I didn't," and Barbara spoke rather crossly. "If I had, I should have gone and described him to the police the first thing this morning." She felt inclined to add that it was a pity he could not inculcate his own children with some of his apparent courage, for they both seemed far more frightened than interested in the story, and the son's eyes looked as if they would jump out of his head. Perhaps the poor youth was scolded for his timidity afterwards, for when Barbara passed their room in going upstairs to get ready to go out, she heard the father speaking in very stern tones, and the boy murmuring piteously, "Oh, father! Oh, father!" Miss Britton was in a hurry to get out, but, as often happens, it proves a case of more haste, less speed, for they had just got into the street when Barbara remembered she had left her purse behind, and had to run back for it. What was her astonishment on opening the bedroom door to see the solicitor's son standing near the window. She had come upstairs very softly, and he had not heard her till she was in the room. Then he turned round suddenly and sprang back with a face filled with terror. "What are you doing here?" she exclaimed in astonishment, and at first he could not answer for fright. I came to look at the place where the man was last night," he gasped at last, "and to see how he could get out of the window." "Well, I think your curiosity has run away with your politeness," Barbara said. "You might have seen from the garden that the balcony is quite close enough to the tree for anyone to get out easily. Is there anything else you would like to examine?" She need hardly have asked, for he had hurried round to the door before she had half finished speaking, and only murmuring, "I'm sorry," fled precipitately. She was really rather sorry for him, he looked so abjectly miserable. Nevertheless, she took the precaution of locking the door and putting the key under the mat. She went downstairs more slowly than she had come up, for the boy's visit had made her feel rather queer. The way he shrank back into the window when she came in had reminded her so much of the manner in which the black figure had acted in the night, and she felt there was something uncanny about the whole thing. However, she made up her mind to say nothing to her aunt, just then, in case of spoiling her afternoon's pleasure, but she was quite determined to make some rather pointed remarks to the solicitor, that evening, when no one else was listening, and see how he took them. Unfortunately, however, she had no opportunity of doing so, for when they went down to dinner, none of the solicitor's family were visible, and Mademoiselle Belvoir remarked that they had all gone out to the theatre, and would not be back till late. The remarks, Barbara supposed, must be postponed till the morrow, but, alas! she never had a chance of making them, for early on the morrow the whole house learned that the solicitor, with his son and daughter, had gone, with apparently no intention of returning. Mademoiselle Belvoir and her brother had waited up till long after the time they should have returned, and then the brother had hurried to the prefecture to report the matter. He had been growing very suspicious of late, as the solicitor had not paid anything for 3 weeks. Waiting for his cheque-book, which had been mislaid, he had said. But the suspicions had been acted on too late, and his mother was cheated out of ever so much money. Every one was highly indignant, and Miss Britton and her niece really felt very grieved that they should have been British subjects who had behaved so badly. Aunt Anne said she almost felt as if she ought to pay for them and save the honour of their country, but Barbara thought that would be too chaotic. At first Mademoiselle Belvoir thought there might be something inside the man's trunks that would repay them a little for the money lost, but on being opened, there proved to be nothing but a few old clothes, and Mademoiselle and her brothers remembered that the boy had often gone out carrying parcels, which they used to laugh at. When all this was being discussed, Barbara thought she might as well tell about finding the boy in her room, and she mentioned her suspicions that he and the nocturnal visitor were one and the same person, and found to her surprise that the Belvoirs had thought the same. Poor things! Barbara was heartily sorry for them, for it was an unpleasant occurrence to happen in a pension, and might make a difference to them in future, apart from the fact that they could hear nothing of the lost money, nor yet of the runaways. Barbara felt that hitherto her adventures in France had been quite like a story-book, and knew that when her brother Donald heard of them he would be making all kinds of wonderful plans for the discovery of the miscreants. "He would fancy himself an amateur detective at once," she said to her aunt, whereupon that lady returned grimly that she would gladly become a detective for the time being if she thought there was any chance of finding the wretches, but that such people usually hid their tracks too well. Nevertheless, Barbara noticed that she eyed her fellow men with great suspicion, and one day she persisted in pursuing a stout gentleman with blue glasses, whom she declared was the solicitor in disguise, till he noticed them and began to be nervously agitated. "I'm sure it isn't he, aunt," Barbara whispered, after they had followed him successfully from Notre Dame to St. Etienne, and from there to Napoleon's tomb. "He speaks French, I heard him. Besides, he is too stout for the solicitor." "He may be padded," Aunt Anne said wisely. "People of that kind can do anything. There is something in his walk that assures me it is he, and I must see him without his spectacles." Barbara followed rather unwillingly, though she could not help thinking with amusement how the family would laugh when she wrote and described her aunt in the role of a detective. She was not to be very successful, however, for as they were sauntering after him down one of the galleries of the museum, the blue-spectacled gentleman suddenly turned round, and in a torrent of French asked to what pleasure he owed Madame's close interest, which if continued would cause him to call up a gendarme. "If you think to steal from me, I am far too well prepared for that," he concluded. "Steal!" Aunt Anne echoed indignantly. "We are certainly not thieves, sir, whatever you may be." Barbara was thankful that apparently his knowledge of English was so slight that he did not understand the remark. It was not without difficulty that she prevailed upon her aunt to pass on and cease the wordy argument, which, she pointed out, was not of much good, as neither understood the other's language sufficiently well to answer to the point. "We shall have all the visitors in the museum round us soon," she urged, with an apprehensive glance at the people who were curiously drawing near, "and perhaps be turned out for making a disturbance." "Then I should go at once to the English ambassador," Aunt Anne said with dignity. "But as I have now seen his eyes and am assured he is not the man we want, we can pass on." And with a stately bow, and the remark that if he annoyed her in future she would feel compelled to complain, she moved away, Barbara following, crimson with mingled amusement and vexation. End of Chapter 4. Read by Sibella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 5 of Barbara and Brittany by E.A. Gillie. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 5. Goodbye to Paris. The days in Paris flew past far too quickly for Barbara, who enjoyed everything to the full. As she came to know her aunt better, and got accustomed to her dry manner and rather exact ways, she found her to be a really good companion, not altogether lacking in humour, and having untiring energy in sight-seeing and a keen sympathy with Barbara's delight in what was new. Perhaps Miss Britton, too, was gaining more pleasure from the trip than she had expected, for up till now she had seen her niece only as one a little sobered by responsibility and the constraint of her own presence. Whatever the cause, it was certain that during the past fortnight Miss Britton had felt the days of her youth nearer her than for some time, and it was with mutual regret that they reached the last day of their stay in Paris. They were sitting together on the balcony, with the bees very busy in the lilac bush near them, and the doves murmuring to each other at the end of the garden. Barbara was reading a guide-book on Brittany, and Miss Britton, with her knitting in her hands, was listening to bits the girl read aloud, and watching a little frown grow between the eyebrows. It was curious how the frown between the dark brows reminded her of her dead brother, and after a moment she laid down her knitting. "You may think it a little unkind," she began, that I am not coming with you to see what kind of a place it is to which you are going, but I think it is good for a girl to learn to be independent and self-reliant. I made careful inquiries, and the people seem to be very good at teaching French. They used to live in Paris, and they are quite respectable. Of course you may not find everything just as you like, and if it is really unpleasant you can write me, and I shall arrange for you to return here. But Paris would be more distracting for you to live in, and in a week or two far too hot to be pleasant. Besides, I should like you really to study the language, so that you may profit by your stay in France, as well as enjoy it. If I stayed with you, you would never talk French all the time." She stopped a moment, and took a stitch or two in her knitting, then added in a tone quite different from her usual quick, precise way, "Your father was a splendidly straight, strong man, in body and mind. Try to be like him in every way. He would have wished his eldest daughter to be sensible and courageous." Barbara flushed with pleasure at the praise of her father. She had never heard her aunt mention him before, and she leaned forward eagerly. "Thank you, Aunt Anne. I want to be like him." She would gladly have kissed her, but the family habit of reserve was strong upon her. "Let me see," continued her aunt. "Can you ride?" Barbara laughed. "I used to ride Topsy, the Shetland, you know, long ago, but father sold him." Her eyes followed her aunt's across the garden and the end of the street, to the distant glimpse of the Bois de Boulogne, where riders passed at frequent intervals, and her eyes glowed. "Doesn't it look jolly?" she said. "I used to love it." Aunt Anne nodded. "I used to ride in my youth, and your father rode beautifully before he was married, and when he could afford to keep a horse. He would like you to have done so too, I think. If there is any place where you can learn in St. Servan, you may. It will be a good change from your studies." "Oh, aunt!" And this time reserve was thrown to the winds, and Barbara most heartily embraced her. "Oh, how perfectly splendid of you! It has always been my dream to ride properly, but I never, never thought it would come true." "Dreams do not often," Miss Britton returned, with a scarcely audible sigh. Then she gathered up her soft white wool. "There is the first bell, child, and we have not changed for dinner. Come, be quick." The next morning a heavily laden cab passed from Rue St. Sulpice through the gates into the city. Miss Britton, finding that a friend of the Belvoirs was going almost the whole way to St. Servan, had arranged for Barbara to go under her care. But it was with very regretful eyes that the girl watched the train, bearing her aunt away, leave the station, and she was rather a silent traveller when, later in the morning, she was herself en route for St. Servan. Not so her companion, however, a most talkative personage, who was hardly quiet 5 minutes consecutively. She poured forth all sorts of confidences about her family and friends, and seemed quite satisfied if Barbara merely nodded and murmured "Comme c'est intéressant," though she did not understand nearly all her companion said. The latter pointed out places of interest in passing, and finally, with an effusive good-bye, got out at the station before St. Servan. As the train neared its destination, Barbara looked anxiously to see what the town was like, and her disappointment was great at the first glimpse of the place. When the family had looked up the encyclopaedia for a description of St. Servan, it seemed to be that of a small, old-fashioned place, and Barbara had pictured it a little more than a village, with a picturesque beach. Instead of that, she saw many houses, some tall chimneys, and quays with ships lying alongside. It would have cheered her had she known that the station was really a considerable distance from the town, and in the ugliest part of it, but that she did not find out till later. Outside the station were many vociferous cab drivers offering to take her anywhere she liked, and choosing the one whose horse seemed best cared for, she inquired if he knew where the house of Mademoiselle Loiré, Rue Calvados, was. Grinning broadly, he bade her step in, and presently they were rolling and bumping along rough cobblestone streets. Barbara had further imagined, from the description of the house, that Mademoiselle Loiré had sent them, that it was a villa standing by itself, and was rather surprised when the fiacre, after climbing a very steep street, stopped at a door and deposited herself and her trunks before it. Almost before she rang the bell she heard hurried steps, and the door opened by some one whom she imagined might be the housekeeper. "Is Mademoiselle Loiré in?" she inquired of the thin and severe-looking woman with her hair parted tightly in the middle. "I am Mademoiselle Loiré," she replied stiffly in French, "and you, I suppose, are Miss Britton. I am sorry there was no one at the station to meet you, but we did not expect you so soon." "Did you not get my post-card?" Barbara asked. "I could not possibly do that," Mademoiselle Loiré returned reprovingly. It was posted in Paris far too late for that. However, perhaps you will now come into the salon." And Barbara followed meekly into a room looking out upon the garden, and very full of all kinds of things. She had hardly got in before she heard a bustle on the stairs, which was followed by the entrance of Mademoiselle Thérèse Loiré. Her face was not so long, nor her hair so tightly drawn back as her sister's, and she came forward with a rush, smiling broadly, but somehow Barbara felt she would like the prim sister better. After asking many questions about the journey they took her to her room, and Barbara's heart sank a little. The house seemed dark and cold after that in Neuilly, and her bedroom was paved with red brick, as was the custom in those parts in old houses. The dining room, smelling somewhat of damp, was a long, low room leading straight into the garden, and the whole effect was rather depressing. At supper time, Barbara was made acquainted with the rest of the household, which consisted of an adopted niece, a plump girl of about 17, with very red cheeks and a very small waist, and 2 boys about 12, who were boarding with the Loirés, so they might go to the lycée, or public school, in town. After supper, Mademoiselle Thérèse explained that they usually went for a walk with the widower and his children who lived next door. "Poor things," she said, "they know nobody when they came to town, and a widower in France is so shut off from companionship that we thought we must be kind to them. They have not a woman in the house except a charer, who comes in the first thing in the morning." Barbara, with a chuckle over the charer, went to put on her hat, and, in coming to the dining room again, found the widower and his sons already there. Something in the shape of the back of the elder man seemed familiar to her, and on his turning round to greet her she recognised her little friend of the train on their first arrival in France. The recognition was mutual, and before she had time to speak he rushed forward and poured forth a torrent of French, while Mademoiselle Thérèse clamoured for an explanation, which he finally gave her. At last he had to stop for want of breath, and Barbara had time to look at his sons, boys of 12 and 16, who seemed a great care to him. All the 3, father and sons, wore cloaks with hoods to them, which they called capucines, and as there was very little difference in their heights, they made rather a quaint trio. Barbara was glad to see him again, however, for it seemed to bring her aunt nearer. It amused her considerably to notice how Mademoiselle Thérèse flew from one party to another during the whole of the walk, evidently feeling that she was the chaperone of each individual. She started out beside the widower, but soon interrupted his conversation by dashing off to give a word of warning to the boys, and what was supposed to be a word of encouragement to Barbara, who was walking with Marie, the niece, and the widower's eldest son. It did not make much difference to them, for Jean and Marie seemed to have plenty to say, and after addressing a few careless remarks to Barbara, to which, perhaps, she did not pay much attention, the latter heard her say to her companion, "Bah! there is nothing to be made of her, let us continue," and she was glad they left her alone that first evening, for she was not in the mood for talking. Chapter 6 Read by Sibella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Barbara and Brittany by E. A. Gillie. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 6 The Revolt of Two. The days that followed were not as pleasant to Barbara as those she had spent in Paris, for though St. Malo, just across the river, fascinated her, she did not care much for St. Servan, and the people did not prove congenial to her, especially Mademoiselle Thérèse. Though she seemed to be a clever teacher, Barbara could never be sure that she was speaking the truth, and in writing home she described her as rather a humbug. "Most English people," she told Barbara shortly after her arrival, "pronounce French badly because their mouths are shaped differently from ours, but yours, Miss Britton, is just right, therefore your accent is already wonderfully good." The girl laughed. The family had never been in the habit of flattering one another, and she did not appreciate it as much as Mademoiselle Thérèse had meant she should. Indeed, Barbara wished that the lady would be less suave to her and more uniform in temper towards the rest of the household, who sometimes, she shrewdly surmised, suffered considerably from the younger sister's irascibility. She had just been in St. Servan 10 days, when she had an example of what she described in a letter home as a stage quarrel between the Mademoiselles Loiré. It began at second déjeuner over some trivial point in the education of Marie, about whom they were very apt to be jealous. Their voices gradually rose higher and higher, the remarks made being anything but complimentary, till finally Mademoiselle Loiré, jumped from her seat, saying she would not stay there to be insulted, and darted upstairs. Her sister promptly followed, continuing her argument as she went, but arriving too late at the study door, which was bolted on the inside by the fugitive. After various fruitless attempts to make herself heard, Mademoiselle Thérèse returned to the dining room, and after a few words of politeness to Barbara, began once more on the subject of dispute, this time with Marie, her niece. Apparently the latter took a leaf out of her aunt's book, for after speaking noisily for a few minutes, she said she would not be insulted either, and followed her upstairs. Thereupon Mademoiselle Thérèse's anger knew no bounds, and finding that Marie had taken refuge beside her aunt in the study, she began to beat a lively tattoo upon the door. The two boys, full of curiosity, followed to see what was going on, so Barbara was left in solitary grandeur with the ruins of an omelette before her, and she, having hunger, went on stolidly with her meal. She was, in truth, a little disgusted with the whole affair, and was not sorry to escape to her room before Mademoiselle Thérèse returned. They were making such noise below that it was useless to attempt to do any work, and she was just thinking of going out for a walk, when her door burst open and in rushed Mademoiselle Loiré, dragging Marie with her. "Keep her with you," she panted. "She says she will kill my sister. Keep her with you while I go down and argue with Thérèse." Barbara looked sharply at the girl, and it seemed to her that though she kept murmuring, "I'll kill her, I'll kill her," half her anger was merely assumed, and that there was no necessity for alarm. "How can they be so silly and theatrical?" she murmured. Then, glancing around the room to see if there were anything she could give her, she noticed a bottle of Eno's fruit salts, and her eyes twinkled. It was not exactly the same thing as sal volatile, of course, but at any rate it would keep the girl quiet, so pouring out a large glassful, she bade Marie drink it. The latter obeyed meekly, and for some time was reduced to silence by want of breath. "I shall certainly throw myself into the sea," she gasped at last. "Well, you will certainly be more foolish than I thought you were, if you do," Barbara returned coolly. "Indeed, I can't think what all this fuss is about." Marie stared. "Why, it's to show Aunt Thérèse she must not tyrannize over us like that," she said. "I told her I was going to throw myself into the sea, and, as she believes it, it is almost the same thing." Barbara shrugged her shoulders. "A very comfortable way of doing things in cold weather," she remarked. "But I want a little quiet now, and I think you had better have some too." The French girl, somewhat overawed by the other's coolness, relapsed into silence, and when the sounds downstairs seemed quieter Barbara got up, and said she was going for a walk. She found on descending, however, that the argument had only been transferred to Mademoiselle's workroom, where a very funny sight met her eyes when she looked in. The poor little widower, whom apparently the two sisters had fetched to arbitrate between them, stood looking fearfully embarrassed in the middle of the room, turning apologetically from one to the other. He never got any further than the first few words, however, as they brought a torrent of explanation from both his hearers, each giving him dozens of reasons why the other was wrong. Marie, who watched for a moment or two, could not help joining in, and Barbara, very tired of it all, left them to fight it out by themselves, and went away by the winding streets to the look-out station, where she sat down and watched the sun shining on the beautiful old walls of St. Malo. She had only been once in that town with Mademoiselle Thérèse, but the ramparts and the old houses had fascinated her, and if she had been allowed, she would have crossed the little moving bridge daily. When she returned, the house seemed quiet again, for which reason she was very thankful, and mounting to her room, she prepared the French lesson which was usually given her at that time. But when Mademoiselle Thérèse came up, she spent most of the time in bewailing the ingratitude of one's fellow mortals, especially near relations, and wondering if Marie were really going to drown herself, and when her older sister would unlock her door and come out of the room. Supper was rather a doleful meal, and immediately after it Mademoiselle went to look for her niece, who had not returned. Barbara laughed a little scornfully at her fears, and even when she came back with the news that Marie was not concealed next door, as she had thought, refused to believe that the girl was not hiding somewhere else. "But where could she be except next door?" Mademoiselle questioned. "And when I went to ask, Monsieur Dubois was seated with his sons having supper, and no signs of the truant. He had seen or heard nothing of her, he said." Barbara wondered which had been deceived, and whether the widower himself was deceived or deceiver, but giving up the attempts to decide the question, retired to bed, advising Mademoiselle to do the same, feeling some curiosity, but no anxiety, as to Marie's fate. She had not been in bed very long when she heard some one move stealthily downstairs and enter the dining-room. Mademoiselle Thérèse, she knew, had locked all the doors and gone to her bedroom, which was in the front of the house, and she immediately guessed that it must be something to do with Marie. "The plot thickens," she said to herself, stealing to the window, which looked out upon the garden. There, to her amazement, she saw Mademoiselle Loiré emerging laboriously from the dining-room window. She saw her in the moonlight creep down the garden towards the wall at the end, but what happened after that she could only guess at, as the trees cast a shadow which hid the lady from view. "The lady or the tiger," she said, laughing as she peered into the shades of the trees, and about 5 minutes later was rewarded by seeing two figures hurry back and enter the house by the same way that Mademoiselle Loiré had got out. "Marie!" she thought triumphantly, wondering in what part of the garden she had been hidden, as there was no gate in the direction from which she had come. She lay awake for a little while, meditating on the vagaries of the family she had fallen into, and then fell so soundly asleep that she was surprised to find it broad daylight when she awoke, and to see Marie sitting on the end of her bed, smiling beamingly upon her. "So you're back?" Barbara inquired with a yawn. "I hope you didn't find it too cold in the garden last night." "You saw us, then?" giggled Marie. "But you don't know where I came from, do you? Nor does Aunt Thérèse. I'll tell you now. Such an exciting time I've had, just like a story-book heroine." "Penny novelette heroine," murmured Barbara, but her visitor was too full of her adventure to notice the remark. "As you know, I told Aunt Thérèse I should drown myself," she began complacently, "but of course such was not my intention." "Of course not," interpolated Barbara dryly. "Instead, I confided my plan to Aunt Marie, then slipped out into the street, and thence to our friends next door." "The widowers?" exclaimed the English girl in surprise. "The very same. I explained to him my project for giving my aunt a wholesome lesson, and he with true chivalry invited me to sup with them. He saw I was spent with hunger." Barbara, looking at the plump, rosy face of her companion, which had assumed a tragic air, stifled a laugh, and the girl continued. "I spent a pleasant time, and was just finishing my repast when the bell rang. 'My aunt!' I cried. 'Hide me from her wrath, monsieur.' 'The coal cellar,' he replied, after a moment's stern thought. In 1 second I had disappeared, I was no more, and when my aunt entered she found him at supper with his sons. When she had gone I returned, and we spent the evening cheerfully in mutual congratulation. At nightfall, when we considered all was secure, Aunt Marie came into the garden, placed a ladder against the wall, and I passed from one garden into the other, and regained our room securely. I think Aunt Thérèse suspected nothing. Monsieur Dubois is such a beautiful deceiver." "Well, I think you ought to be ashamed of yourself," Barbara said hotly. "Apart from the meanness and deceitfulness of it all, you have behaved most childishly, and I shall always think less of Monsieur Dubois for his untruthfulness." "Untruthfulness!" Marie returned in an offended tone. "He acted most chivalrously, but you English have such barbarous notions about chivalry." For a moment Barbara felt tempted to get up and shake the girl, then came to the conclusion that it would be waste of time and energy to argue with an individual whose ideas were so hopelessly dissimilar to her own. "I'm going to get up now," she said shortly. "I'll be glad if you would go." "But don't you want to know what we are going to do now?" queried Marie, a little astonished that her companion should not show more interest in such an exciting adventure. "Our campaign has only begun. We will make Aunt Thérèse capitulate before we have done. After all, she is the younger. We intend to stay in our rooms without descending until she promises to ask pardon for her insults, and say no more of the matter, and we will go out nightly to get air, carefully avoiding meeting her, and will buy ourselves sausages and chocolate, and so live until she sees how wrong she has been." She ended with great pride, feeling that at length she must have made an impression on this prosaic English girl, and was much disconcerted when Barbara broke into laughter, crying, "Oh, you goose, how can you be so silly?" Marie rose with hurt dignity. "You have no feeling for romance," she said. "Your horizon is most commonplace." Then, struck by a sudden fear, she added, "But you surely will not be unpleasant enough to tell Aunt Thérèse what I have confided to you? I trusted you." "No," Barbara said, a little unwillingly. "I won't tell her, but I wish you had left me out of the matter entirely, for I certainly cannot lie to her." And with this Marie had to be content. End of Chapter 6. Read by Sibella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Brittany by E. A. Gillie. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 7. A Wild Drive. The uncomfortable campaign, as Marie had called it, continued for some days, and Barbara was in the unpleasant condition of having both parties confide in her. At the end of that time, however, it seemed as if the dainties that sustained the two upstairs began to pall upon them, as housekeeping evidently did on Mademoiselle Thérèse, and Barbara saw signs of a truce. This was doubtlessly hastened by the news that an old family friend was coming with his wife and daughter on the next Sunday afternoon, and, as Mademoiselle Thérèse explained, they must keep up appearances. He was a lawyer who lived at Dol, and from the preparations that were made, Barbara saw that they thought a great deal of him, for there was such baking and cooking as had never been since her arrival. The salad even was adorned with rose leaves, and looked charming, while the Mademoiselle Loiré clothed themselves in their best garments. They all sat in state in the drawing-room as the hour for the arrival of the visitors approached, trying to look as if they had never heard of soufflé or mayonnaise salad, and Barbara, who had been called upon to taste each of the dishes in turn and give an opinion on their worth, almost felt as if she never wished to hear of such things again. About 12 o'clock a fiacre stopped at the door, and a few minutes later the visitors were announced: father, mother, and daughter. Barbara was agreeably surprised, as indeed she often was by the Loirés' friends, to find that they were so nice. The mother and daughter were both very fashionably dressed, but simple and frank; the father, however, being most attractive to Barbara. He was clever and amusing, and contradicted Mademoiselle Thérèse in such an audacious way that had it been anyone else, she would have retired to her bedroom offended for a week. The visit passed most successfully, Mademoiselle Loiré's cooking being quite as much appreciated as she had expected, and when the visitors said good-bye, Barbara left the sisters congratulating themselves on their success. A few days later the final word was added to the truce between the sisters by Mademoiselle Thérèse proposing that she should stay at home and look after the house, while her sister took Barbara and Marie for a visit to Cancale, whose beauties, Mademoiselle Thérèse assured Barbara, had a world-wide renown. But the elder sister, though obviously pleased by the suggestion, thought she would rather Thérèse went, while she stayed at St. Servan and paid a few calls that she was desirous of making. After much discussion it was so determined, and the following day Mademoiselle Thérèse, with the two girls, set off after lunch by the train. The ride was a pleasant one, and the magnificent view of the Bay of Cancale with the Mont Saint Michel in the distance delighted Barbara's heart. She much preferred the quaint little fishing village, La Houle, nesting at the foot of the cliffs, to the more fashionable quarter of the town, but Mademoiselle Thérèse, who was bent on seeing the fashions of the visitors, led the way with energy to the hotel half-way up the cliff. It was certainly gay enough there, and the Frenchwoman explained to her pupil that if one noticed the costumes at seaside resorts it often saved buying fashion books. They sat on the terrace, Mademoiselle and Marie dividing their attention between a stout lady in a gorgeous toilette of purple trimmed with blue, and oysters, which, the Frenchwoman assured Barbara, were one of the beauties of the place. But the latter contented herself with tea, wondering idly, as she drank it, why the beverage so often tasted of stewed hay. After their refreshment they strolled round the town, and then sat upon the promenade, watching the sun travel slowly down the sky towards the sea-line. Suddenly Mademoiselle remembered the time, and, looking at her watch, declared they had but few minutes in which to get the train, and that they must run if they wished to catch it. Off they started, Mademoiselle panting in the rear, calling upon the girls to wait, and gasping out that it would be of no use to arrive without her. They were extremely glad on arriving at the terminus to see that they still had a minute or two to spare. "We are in time for the train?" Mademoiselle asked of a gendarme standing near the station-house. The man stared at her. "Certainly, madame," he said at last. "But would it not be as well to come here in the morning?" "In the morning?" she echoed. "You foolish fellow! We want to go by this train. It should be here now. It leaves at 7:30. "Ah!" the man said, and he seemed to understand. "I fear you have lost that train by several days. It went last Sunday." "What!" screamed mademoiselle. "How dare you mock me? I will report you." "That must be as madame wishes," returned the man with horrible calmness. "But the train madame wishes to get only runs on Sundays, and therefore she must wait several days for the next. If any other train will do, there is one in the morning at 9:30. Barbara wanted to laugh, but consideration, or fear, of Mademoiselle Thérèse kept her quiet, and they stood gazing at one another in sorrowful silence. A 10-mile walk at 7:30 in the evening, unless with very choice companions, is not an unmitigated pleasure, especially when one has been walking during the day. However, there was nothing for it but to walk, as a conveyance, if obtainable, would have been too expensive for Mademoiselle Thérèse's economical ideas. They declared at first that it was a lovely evening, and began to cheer their way by sprightly conversation, but a mile or two of dusty highroad told upon them, and silence fell with the darkness. It was a particularly hot evening, too, and great heat, as every one knows, frequently tends to irritation, so perhaps their silence was judicious. Mademoiselle Thérèse kept murmuring at intervals that it really was most annoying, as her sister would have been expecting them much earlier, and would be so vexed. Perhaps a vision of a second retirement, which no family friend would come to relieve, floated before her eyes. More than half the distance had been covered when they heard the sound of wheels behind them. "A carriage!" cried Mademoiselle, roused to sudden energy. "They must give us a lift." And drawing up by the side of the road, they waited anxiously to know their fate. It was fairly dark by this time, and they could not distinguish things clearly, but they saw a big horse, with a light open cart behind. When Mademoiselle first began to speak, the driver took not the least notice, but after going a few yards, pursued by her with praiseworthy diligence and surprising vigour, he pulled up and pointed to the seat behind, the place beside him being already filled with a trunk. The wanderers scrambled in joyfully, greatly pleased with their good luck, and it was not until they were in their places, and near the man, that they discovered he had been drinking freely and was not as clear-headed as he might have been. If there had been time they would all have got out again, but he whipped up so quickly that there was no chance. He continued to whip up, moreover, till they were going at a most break-neck speed. Mademoiselle, clinging madly to the side of the cart, begged him in the midst of her gasps and exclamations to let them descend, but the more she begged, and the more desperate she became, the better pleased he seemed, and it really looked as if they might all be thrown into the ditch. Then Mademoiselle, who was always rather nervous about driving, broke into shrill screams, with Marie joining in at intervals. Gilpin's flight was nothing to it, and the cart jolted and swayed so that calm expostulation was impossible. A lesson in rough riding to a beginner could not have proved a more disjointing experience, and the man, chuckling over the loudly expressed fear of his companions, drove on. Fortunately there were not many turns, and the road was fairly wide all the way, but once Barbara felt the hedge brush her face, and Marie's handkerchief, which she had been using to mop up her tears, was borne away a few minutes later by the bushes on the opposite side of the road. The only thing that could be said in favour of the drive was that they covered the ground with great speed, and the thought occurred to Barbara that it would be by no means pleasant to enter the streets of St. Servan with their present driver and two screaming women, as apart from other considerations, they might meet the policeman, and the encounter would be unpleasant. She told Mademoiselle and Marie that if they did not want to be killed or locked up in the prefecture, they must jump off the back of the cart while going up the hill outside the town. The horse, after its wild career, would calm down on the incline, besides which, a fall in the road would be preferable to being thrown through a shop window. It took very forcible language to make Mademoiselle Thérèse face present terror rather than await the future, but when the horse really did slow to a walk, and the girls had reached the ground in safety, she made a mighty effort, and floundered out in a heap upon the road, making so much noise that Barbara was afraid the man would realize they were gone, and insist upon their getting in again. But he whipped up at that moment, and the noise of the cart drowned the dolorous complaints. The girls soothed their companion by assuring her that in 10 minutes they would be home, when most assuredly her sister's heart would be moved to pity by their sorry plight and the tale of their adventures. Just as they arrived at their own door they met Mademoiselle Loiré hurrying up, and her sister, thinking she was coming to look for them, and not knowing the reception she might get, fell upon her neck, pouring forth with incoherent sobs and explanations the tale of their woes. Mademoiselle Loiré was most sympathetic and unreproachful, and having dried her sister's tears, led her into the house, where the whole party sat down to cake and cider, under the influence of which Mademoiselle Thérèse quite recovered, and retold their adventures, Barbara realizing for the first time, as she listened, what heroines they had been. Their screaming advance along the high road became a journey, where they sat grimly, with set teeth, listening to the curses of a madman, and bowing their heads to escape, having them cut off repeatedly by the branches of trees. Their ignominious exit from the cart on the hill became a desperate leap into the darkness, when the vehicle was advancing at full gallop, and when Barbara finally rose to say good night, she felt as if they had all been princesses in a fairy tale, in which, alas! there had been no prince. She learned two things on the morrow, not counting the conviction that riding at a gallop in a cart made one desperately stiff. The first was from Marie, who told her that Mademoiselle Loire's forbearance with their late return, and her intense sympathies with their adventures, probably arose from the fact that she had just been returning from her own expedition when she met the wanderers, and had been filled with very similar fears concerning her reception as those which had filled her sister's heart. The other fact, which Barbara read aloud to Mademoiselle Thérèse from the newspaper, was that Jean Millet had been apprehended for furious driving at a late hour the previous night, and would have to pay a heavy fine. How he had come safely through the streets at such speed, said the journalist, was a miracle. Fortunately, there was no one in the cart but himself. Fortunately, indeed, there was not, remarked Barbara, folding up the paper. End of Chapter 7. Read by Sibella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Barbara and Brittany by E. A. Gillie. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 8. Mont Saint Michel. The following day Barbara was taken to a confirmation service at a Roman Catholic church in the town, for one of Marie's younger brothers was coming from the country to be confirmed. Barbara watched the service curiously, feeling rather as if she were in a dream. The bishop entered the church with much pomp, adorned in wonderful lace and embroidered vestments. His progress up the aisle was slow, for there were many mothers and sisters with little children, whom they presented to him for his blessing, and he patiently stopped beside each, giving them his ring to kiss. He was waited on by the clergy of the church and some from the country round, and those latter amused Barbara not a little, for they carried their rochets in newspapers, or in shabby brown bags, which they left in corners of the seats, while they slipped on their rochets in full view of everyone. Then the boys, accompanied by their godfathers, the girls by their godmothers, filed slowly up to the bishop, who blessed each in turn. On leaving him they passed in front of two priests, the first attended by a boy bearing a basket of cotton wool pellets dipped in oil, the second by a boy with a basket of towels. The first priest rubbed the forehead of each child with oil, and the next one dried it, after which they went singing to their places. The ceremony was a very long one, and Barbara was not very sorry when it was over. She grew weary before the close, and was glad when they made their way home, accompanied by Marie's father, the Loire's half-brother, and the little boy. The former was a farmer in the country, and Barbara thought he was much pleasanter to look upon than either his daughter or his sisters. Mademoiselle Loire had provided him at lunch with his favourite dish, shrimps, and Barbara could hardly eat anything herself, being completely fascinated with watching him. He had helped himself pretty liberally, and to her amazement, began to eat them with lightning speed. He bent fairly low over his plate, resting an elbow on each side, and putting in the whole shrimp with his left hand, almost immediately seemed to take out the head and tail with the other, working with machine-like regularity. It was an accomplishment that Barbara was sure would bring him in a lot of money at a show, and she began to picture to herself a large advertisement, "Instantaneous Shrimp Eater," and the products that might arise therefrom. When he had almost demolished the dish of shrimps he stopped, looked a little regretfully at the debris on his plate, then straightened himself in his chair, and began to take an interest in what was going on around him. He smiled benignly on his sisters, teased his daughter, and looked with shy curiosity at Barbara, to whom he did not dare to address any remarks until nearly the end of lunch. Then he said, very slowly, and in a loud voice as if speaking to a deaf person, "Has the English mademoiselle visited the Mont Saint Michel yet?" Barbara shook her head. "It is a pleasure for the future, I hope," she said. "But certainly, of course, she must go there," he said, still speaking laboriously. Then, after that effort, as if exhausted, he relapsed into silence. But Mademoiselle Thérèse pursued the idea, and before the meal was over had fixed a day in the following week for the excursion. As her sister had already been at the Mont more than once, it was decided she should remain with Marie, so that the pleasant task of accompanying Barbara fell, as usual, to Mademoiselle Thérèse. At the last moment the numbers were increased by the little widower, who suddenly made up his mind to join them, with his eldest son. "It is long since I have been," he declared, "and it is a part of the education of Jean to see the wonders of his native land. Therefore, mademoiselle, if you permit us, we will join you to morrow. It will be doubly pleasant for us to go in the company of one so learned." Mademoiselle Thérèse could not help bowing at such a compliment, but it is doubtful whether she really appreciated the widower's proposal. The little man was quite capable of contradicting information she might give Barbara if he thought it incorrect, and when he was there she could not keep the conversation entirely in her own hands. By the girl's most earnest request, she had agreed to stay the night at the Mont, and they started off in highest spirits by an early morning train. Her two companions poured into Barbara's ears a full historical account of Mont St. Michel, sometimes agreeing, sometimes contradicting each other, and the girl was glad that, when at last the long stretch of weird and lonely sandflats was reached, they seemed to have exhausted their eloquence. "But where is the sea?" she asked in surprise. "I thought you said the sea would be all around it." Mademoiselle Thérèse looked a little uncomfortable. "Yes, the sea, of course. I expected the tide would be high. It ought to be up, I am sure. You told me, too, that the tide would be high," and she turned so quickly upon the widower that he jumped nervously. "Yes, of course. That is to say, you told me the tide should be high at present, and I said I did not doubt it since you said it, but I heard some one remarking a few minutes ago that it would be up to morrow." "Never mind," Barbara interposed, for she saw signs of a fresh discussion. "It will be all the nicer to see it rise, I am sure," and fortunately the widower and Mademoiselle Thérèse agreed with her. The train, crowded with visitors, puffed slowly towards St. Michel, and Barbara watched the dim outline of grey stone become clearer, till the full beauty of the Abbey and the Merveille burst upon her sight. "St. Michael and all angels," she murmured, looking up towards the golden figure of the Archangel on the top of the Abbey. "He looks as if guarding the place, but what cruel things went on below him!" "Shocking tragedies," mademoiselle assured her, having heard the last words. "Shocking tragedies. But let us be quick and get out, or else we shall not arrive in time for the first lunch. Now you are going to taste Madame Poulard's omelettes, a food ambrosial. You will wonder. They alone are worth coming to the Mont St. Michel for." They hurried out over the wooden gangway that led from the train lines to the gate at the foot of the Mont, and entered the strange stepped streets, and marvelled at the houses clinging to the rock. They were welcomed into the inn by Madame Poulard herself, who, resting for a moment at the doorway from her labours in the kitchen, stood smiling upon all comers. Barbara looked with interest at the long, low dining room, whose walls bore tokens of the visits of so many famous men and women, and at whose table there usually gathered folk from so many different nations. "There is an Englishman," she said eagerly to Mademoiselle Thérèse, for it seemed quite a long time since she had seen one of her countrymen so near. "But yes, of course," mademoiselle answered, shrugging her shoulders. "What did you expect? They go everywhere." And she turned her attention to her plate. "One must be fortified by a good meal," she said in her solemn whisper to Barbara as they rose, "to prepare one for the blood-curdling tales we are about to hear while seeing over the Abbey." And though the girl allowed something for exaggeration, it was quite true that, after hearing the stories, and seeing the pictures of those who had perished in the dungeons, she felt very eerie when being taken through them. In the damp darkness she seemed to realise the terror that imprisonment there must have held, and she thought she could almost hear the moans of the victims and the scraping of the rats, who were waiting for the end. "Oh!" she cried, drawing a long breath when they once more emerged into the open air. "You seem hardly able to breathe down there even for a little while, and for years." She shuddered. How could they bear it? "One learns to bear everything in this life," Mademoiselle Thérèse replied sententiously, shaking her head and looking as if she knew what it was to suffer acutely. "One is set on earth to learn to suffer and grow strong, as one of your English poets says." Barbara turned away impatiently, and felt she could gladly have shaken her companion. "One wants to come to a place like this with nice companions or alone," she thought, and it was this feeling that drove her out on to the ramparts that evening after dinner. She was feeling happy at having successfully escaped from the noisy room downstairs, and thankful to the game of cards that had beguiled Mademoiselle Thérèse's attentions from her, when she heard footsteps close beside her, and turning round, saw Jean Dubois. "Whatever do you want here?" she said, a little irritably. Then, hearing his humble answer that he had just come to enjoy the view, felt ashamed of herself, and tried to be pleasant. "Do you know," she said, suddenly determining to share an idea with him to make up for her former rudeness, "that we have seen Mont St. Michel from every side but one, and that is the seaside? I should like to see it every way, wouldn't you? I have just made a little plan, and that is to get up early to-morrow morning, and go out across the sand till I can see it." "Mademoiselle!" the boy exclaimed. "But is it safe? The sands are treacherous, and many have been buried in them." "Yes, I know, but there are lots of footsteps going across them in all directions, and I saw some people out there to-day. If I follow the footprints it will be safe, for where many can go surely one may." It took some time for Jean to grow accustomed to the idea, and he drew his capucine a little closer round him, as if the thought of such an adventure chilled him. Then he laid his hand on Barbara's arm. "I, too," he said, "will see the view from that side. Mademoiselle Barbara, I will come with you." "But your father? Would he approve, do you think?" "But assuredly," Jean said hastily. "He wishes me to get an entire idea of Mont St. Michel, to be permeated, in fact. It is to be an educational visit, he said." "Very well, then. But we must be up very early and very quiet, so that we may not disturb mademoiselle. I am not confiding in her, you understand. Can you be ready at 5:30, so that we may be back before coffee?" "Assuredly. At 5:30 I shall be on the terrace." And Jean's cheeks actually glowed at the thought of the adventure. There was so much romance in it, he thought, and pictured how nice it would be telling the story to Marie afterwards. Barbara herself was very gleeful, for it was nice to be able to act without wondering whether she was showing the younger ones a good example or not. She felt almost as if she were back at school, and that feeling was intensified by the little cubicle bedrooms with which the visitors at Madame Poulard's were provided. She had been a little anxious as to whether she would awaken at the right hour, but found on opening her eyes next morning that she had plenty of time to spare. She dressed noiselessly, for mademoiselle was sleeping in the next room, and she did not want to rouse her, and stole down the passage and into the terrace, where Jean was waiting for her. They were early risers at Mont St. Michel, and the servants looked with some curiosity, mingled perhaps with disapproval, at the couple, but they recognised the girl as English, and of course there was no accounting for what any of that nation did. It was a lovely morning, and Barbara, picking her way over the rocks, hummed gaily to herself, for it was an excursion after her own heart. Jean cast rather a doubtful eye from the rocks to the waste of sand in front of them, but seeing his companion did not hesitate, he could not either, and stepped out boldly beside her. "You see," Barbara explained, "it is really perfectly hard here, and we will keep quite close to the footprints that lead right out to that other rock out there." "But you are surely not going as far as that?" he inquired anxiously. "We should never be back in time for coffee." "I don't think so," Barbara returned gaily, "but we'll see how we get on." When once Jean saw that the ground was perfectly sound beneath their feet, and that the footprints went on unwaveringly, he felt rest assured, and really began to enjoy himself. They turned round every now and then to look back at the Mont, but decided each time that they had not got quite far enough away to get a really good effect. "You know," said Jean, some of his fears returning after a time, "one usually has guides, people who know the sands, to take one out so far. I trod on a very soft place just now." "Keep near the footprints, then," Barbara answered. "The tide hasn't been up yet, and the sands can't surely change in the night time. Just a little farther, and then we will stop." They stopped a few minutes later, and both declared that the view was well worth the walk, the only thing that Barbara regretted being that it was too damp to sit down and enjoy it at their ease. "It would have been nice to get as far as Tomblaine," the girl said at last, turning from St. Michel to take another look at the rocky islet further out, "but I suppose we really must be going home again now." Jean did not answer her. He had turned with her towards the rock, then his eyes had wandered round the horizon, and had remained fixed in such a stare that the girl wondered what he saw. "What is the matter?" she asked. "What is it you are seeing, Jean?" "The sea!" he gasped, his face becoming ashen. "Mademoiselle! The tide! It advances! We will be caught!" Barbara looked across the long stretch of grey sand till her eyes found the moving line of water. "It is nearer," she said slowly, "but of course it always comes in every day." "Yes, but to-day I had forgotten. It is to be high tide, all around the Mont. Did you not hear them say so?" "Yes," Barbara owned, "I remember quite well now. But let us hurry. It is a long way off yet. We have plenty of time." She spoke consolingly, for Jean's face was blanched, and she saw he was trembling. "But, mademoiselle, you do not understand. Did you not hear them telling us also that the tide advances so rapidly that it catches the quickest horse? Oh, I wish we had told someone of this journey, that someone had seen us. They would have warned us. We should have been safe." It was then for the first time that the thought of danger entered Barbara's head, and she took her companion's hand. "Let us run, then, quick!" she said. "We are not such a very long way off." Jean hesitated only a moment, his eyes as if fascinated still on the water; then he turned, his face towards the Mont, and sped over the sand more fleetly than Barbara would have believed possible to him, so fleetly, indeed, that he began to leave the girl, who was swift of foot, behind. She glanced over her shoulder at the sea, which certainly was drawing in very rapidly, licking over the sand greedily, then forward at St. Michel, and fell to a walk. She knew she could not run the whole distance, for it was not easy going on the sand, especially when an eye had always to be kept on the guiding footprints. It was some little time before Jean really realized she was not close behind him; then he stopped running and waited for her. "Go on!" she shouted. "Don't wait for me. I can catch you up later." "But it is impossible for me to leave you," he called back on regaining his breath. "But oh, run, if you can, for the water comes very near." One more fleeting glance behind, and Barbara broke into a run again, though her breath came in gasps. "They are seeing us from the Mont," panted Jean. "They have come out to watch the tide rise. Give me your hand. Do not stop, do not stop." Barbara felt that, do as she would, her breath could hold out no longer, and she slackened her pace to a walk once more. Then a great shout went up from the people on the ramparts, and they began waving their hands and handkerchiefs wildly. To them the two figures seemed to be moving so slowly and the great sea behind so terribly fast. Barbara could hear its swish, swish, near enough now, and she felt Jean's hand tremble in her own. "Run yourself," she said, dropping it. "Run, and I'll follow." But he merely shook his head. To speak was a waste of breath, and he meant his to last him till he reached the rocks. He pulled the girl into a trot again, and they plodded on heavily. It was impossible for him to speak now, but he pointed at the rocks below St. Michel, where two men were scrambling down, and Barbara understood that they were coming to aid. The sea was very close, horribly close, when two fishermen met the couple, and taking Barbara's hands on either side, pulled her on, while Jean panted a little way behind. The watching crowd above had been still with fear until they saw the rocks reached; then they shouted again and again, while the many who had scrambled down part of the way hastened forward to see who the adventurous couple were, and to give a helping hand if necessary. One of the first to reach them was the little widower, his cravat loose, his hat off, and tears streaming down his cheeks. "Jean!" he wailed, "what have I done that you should treat me so? What would your sainted mother say were she here to see you thus?" But neither Jean nor Barbara was capable of saying a word, and though the fishermen were urgently assuring the girl that she was not safe yet, that they must go round the rocks to the gate on the other side, she remained sitting doubled up on a rock, feeling that her breath would never come into her body again. "Let her rest a moment," suggested one wiser than the rest. "She cannot move till she breathes. There is yet time enough. Loosen her collar and let her breathe." The sea was gurgling at the foot of the rocks when Barbara regained her breath sufficiently to move, and she was glad enough to have strong arms to help her on her way. Jean and his father reached the gate first, and, therefore, Mademoiselle Thérèse had already exhausted a little of her energy before Barbara appeared. But she was about to fling herself in tears upon the girl's neck when a bystander interposed. "Let her breathe," he said. "Let her go to the inn and get nourishment." And Barbara, the centre of an eager, excited French crowd, was thankful indeed to shelter herself within Madame Poulard's hospitable walls. "We will probably have to stay here a week till she recovers." Mademoiselle Thérèse had a sympathetic audience. "She is of delicate constitution," and the good lady was perhaps a little disappointed when Barbara declared herself perfectly able to go home in the afternoon, as had been arranged. "What should prevent us?" she asked, when after a rest and something to eat she came down to the terrace. "It was only a long race, and a fright which I quite deserved." "Yes, indeed, a fright!" and the Frenchwoman threw up her hands. "Such fear as I felt when I came out to see the tide, and saw you fleeing before it! Your aunt, your mother, my charge! Such visions fleeted before my eyes. But never, never, never will I trust you with Jean any more. and she cast a vengeful look at the widower and his son, who were seated a little farther off. "But it wasn't his fault at all," the girl explained. "On the contrary, I proposed it, and he joined me out of kindness. He pulled me along, too, over the sand. Oh, indeed, you must not be angry with Jean. It was very deceptive of him not to tell me, or his father. Then we could both have come with you, or explained to you that the tide rose early to-day. We heard it was to come early when you were out last night. They say," she went on, shaking her head, "if it had been an equinoctial tide, that neither of you would have escaped. There would have been no shadow of a hope for either. You would have been drowned out there in the damp wet sand." Mademoiselle Thérèse showing signs of weeping again, Barbara hastened to comfort her, assuring her that she would never again go out alone to see St. Michel from that side, which she thought was a perfectly safe promise to make. But her companion shook her head mournfully, declaring that it would be a very long time before she brought any of her pupils to Mont St. Michel again. "They might really get caught next time," she said, and Barbara knew it was no good to point out that probably there would never be another pupil who was quite so silly as she had been. "Nevertheless," the girl said to herself, looking back at the grand grey pile from the train, "except for the fright I gave them, it was worth it all, dear St. Michel, to see you from out there." And Jean, looking pensively out of the window, was thinking that, since it was safely over, the adventure was one which any youth might be proud to tell to his companions, and which few were fortunate or brave enough to have experienced. End of Chapter 8. Read by Sibella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 9 of Barbara and Brittany by E. A. Gillie. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 9. Mademoiselle Viré. "The Loires' chief virtues are their friends," Barbara had written home, and it was always a surprise to her to find that they knew so many nice people. A few days after the adventurous visit to Mont St. Michel, she made the acquaintance of one whom she learned to love dearly, and about whom there hung a halo of romance that charmed the girl. "Her story is known to me," Mademoiselle Thérèse explained on the way to her house, "and I will tell it you, in confidence, of course." She paused a moment to impress Barbara and to arrange her thoughts, for she dearly loved a romantic tale, and would add garnishing by the way if she did not consider it had enough. "She is the daughter of a professor," she began presently. "They used to live in Rouen, grey, beautiful, many-churched Rouen." The lady glanced sideways at her companion to see if her rhetoric were impressive enough, and Barbara waited gravely for her to continue, though wondering if mademoiselle had ever read The Lady of Shalott. "An officer in one of the regiments stationed in the quaint old town," pursued mademoiselle, "saw the professor's fair young daughter, and fell rapturously in love with her. Whereupon they became betrothed." Barbara frowned a little. The setting of the story was too ornate, and seemed almost barbarous. "And then?" she asked impatiently. Then, sighed the storyteller, who thought she was making a great impression, "then the sorrow came. As soon as his family knew, they were grievously angry, furiously wrathful, because she had no dot, and when she heard of their fury and wrath she nobly refused to marry him until he gained their consent. 'Never!' she cried, and it was obvious that here mademoiselle was relying on her own invention, 'never will I marry thee against thy parents' wish.'" She paused, and drew a long breath before proceeding. A short time after this, the regiment of her lover was ordered out to India, in which pestiferous country he took a malicious fever and expired. She has no relatives left now, though so frail and delicate, but lives with an old maid in a very small domicile. She is cultivated to an extreme, and is so fond of music that, though her house is too small to admit of the pianoforte entering by the door, she had it introduced by the window of the salon, which had to be unbricked the window, I mean. She has, moreover, 3 violins, one of which belonged to her ever-to-be-lamented fiancé, and though she is too frail to stand, she will sit, when her health permits, and make music for hours together. Mademoiselle Thérèse uttered the last words on the threshold of the house, and Barbara did not know whether to laugh or cry at such a story being told in such a way. The door was opened by the old maid, Jeannette, who wore a quaint mob cap and spotless apron, and who followed the visitors into the room, and, having introduced them to her mistress, seated herself in one corner and took up her knitting, as company, Mademoiselle Thérèse whispered to Barbara. The latter thought she had never before seen such a charming old lady as Mademoiselle Viré, who now rose to greet them, and she wondered how any one who had known her in the many church Drouin days could have parted from her. She talked for a little while to Mademoiselle Thérèse, then turned gently to Barbara. "Do you play, mademoiselle?" "A little," the girl returned, hesitantly. "Not enough, I'm afraid, to give great pleasure." But Mademoiselle Viré rose with flushed cheeks. "Ah, then, will you do me the kindness to play some accompaniments? That is one of the few things my good Jeanette cannot do for me." And almost before Barbara realized it she was sitting on a high-backed chair before the piano in the little salon, while Mademoiselle Viré sought eagerly for her music. The room was so small that, with Mademoiselle Thérèse and the maid Jeanette, who seemed to be expected to follow her mistress, there seemed hardly room to move in it, and Barbara was all the more nervous by the nearness of her audience. It certainly was rather anxious work, for though the little lady was charmingly courteous, she would not allow a passage played wrongly to go without correction. "I think we were not quite together there, were we?" she would say. "May we play it through again?" And Barbara would blush up to her hair, for she knew the violinist had played her part perfectly. She enjoyed it, though, in spite of her nervousness, and was sorry when it was time to go. "You will come again, I hope?" her hostess asked. "You have given me a happy time." Then, turning eagerly to Jeanette, she added, "Did I play well today, Jeanette?" The quaint old maid rose at once from her seat at the door, and came across the room to put her mistress's cap straight. "Madame played better than I have ever heard her," she replied. Barbara had been so pleased with everything that she went again a few days later by herself, and this time was led into the garden, which, like the house, was very small, but full of roses and other sweet-smelling things. Madame, for Barbara noticed that most people seemed to call her so, was busy watering her flowers, and had on big gloves and an apron. When she saw the girl coming, she came forward to welcome her, saying, with a deprecatory movement towards her apron, "But this apron, these gloves, had I known it was you, mademoiselle, I should have changed them and made myself seemly. Why did you not warn me, Jeanette?" "Madame should not work in the garden and heat herself," the old woman said doggedly. "She should let me do that." But Madame laughed gaily. "Oh, but my flowers know when I water them, and could not bear to have me leave them altogether to others." Then, in explanation to her visitor, "It is an old quarrel between Jeanette and me, is it not, my friend? Now I am hot and thirsty. Will you bring us some of your good wine, Jeanette?" They were sitting in a little bower almost covered with roses, and Barbara felt as if she must be in a pretty dream, when the maid came back bearing two slender-stemmed wine-glasses and a musty bottle covered with cobwebs. "It is very old indeed," Madame explained. "Jeanette and I made it, when we were young, from the walnuts in our garden in Rouen." Having filled both glasses, she raised her own, and said with a graceful bow, "Your health, mademoiselle," and after taking a sip she turned to Jeanette, repeating, "Your health, Jeanette," whereupon the old woman curtsied wonderfully low, considering her stiff knees. Barbara did not like the wine very much, but she would have drunk several glasses to please her hostess, though fortunately she was not asked to do so. They had a long talk, and the old lady related many interesting tales about the life in Rouen and in Paris, where she had often been, so that the time sped all too quickly for the girl. When she got home she found two visitors, who were sitting under the trees in the garden waiting to have tea. One was an English girl of about 14, whom Barbara thought looked both unhappy and sulky. The other was one of the ladies whose school she was at. "This is Alice Meynell," Mademoiselle Thérèse said with some fervour, "and, Alice, this is a fellow countrywoman of your own." But the introduction did not seem to make the girl any happier, and she hardly spoke all tea time, though Marie did her best to carry on a conversation. When she returned to work with Mademoiselle Loiré, the business of the entertainment fell to Barbara, who proposed a walk round the garden. At first the visitor did not seem to care for the idea, but when the mistress with her suggested it was too hot to walk about, she immediately jumped up and said there was nothing she would like better. There seemed to be few subjects that interested her, but when, almost in desperation, Barbara asked how she liked France, she suddenly burst forth into speech. "I hate it!" she cried viciously. "I detest it and the people I am with, who never let me out of their sight. Spies, I call them, spies, not teachers. They even come with me to church. One of them at least, and I feel as if I were in prison." "But surely there is no harm in their coming to church with you," Barbara said. "Besides, in France, you know, they have such strict ideas about chaperons that it's quite natural for them to be careful. Mademoiselle Thérèse goes almost everywhere with me, and I'm a good deal older than you are." "But they're not Protestants I'm sure they're not," the girl returned hotly. "They shouldn't come to church with me; they only pretend. Besides, they don't follow the other girls about nearly so carefully. The worst of it is that I have to stay here for the holidays, too." She seemed very miserable about it, and Barbara thought it might relieve her to confide in someone, and after a little skilful questioning, the whole story came out. Her mother was dead, and her father in the West Indies, and though she wrote him often and fully about everything, she never got any answers to her questions, so that she was sure people opened her letters and put in different news. She was afraid the same thing was done with her father's letters to her, because once something was said by mistake that could have been learned only by reading the news intended for her eyes alone. "He never saw the place," the girl continued. "He took me to my aunt in England, who promised to find me a school. She thought the whole business a nuisance, and was only too glad to find a place quickly where they'd keep me for the holidays, too. She never asks me to go to England, not that I would if she wanted me to." There were angry tears in the girl's eyes, and Barbara thought the case really did seem rather a hard one, though it was clear her companion had been spoiled at home, and had probably had her own way before coming to school. "It does sound rather horrid," Barbara agreed, "and 3 years must seem a long time, but it will go at last, you know." The girl shook her head. "Too slowly far too slowly. It just crawls. I never have anyone to talk things over with either, you see, for I can't trust the French girls; they carry tales, I know. Even now, look how she watches me; she longs to know what I'm saying." Barbara looked round, and it was true that the visitor seemed more interested in watching them than in Mademoiselle Thérèse's conversation, and directly she caught Barbara's eye, she got up hastily and said they must go. Alice Meynell immediately relapsed into sulkiness again, but just as she was saying good-bye she managed to whisper, "I shall run away soon. I know I can't stand it much longer." The others were too near for Barbara to do more than give her a warm squeeze of the hand, but she watched the girl out of sight, feeling very sorry for her. If she had lived a free and easy life on her father's plantation, never having known a mother's care, it was no wonder that she should be a little wild and find her present life irksome. "She looks quite equal to doing something desperate," Barbara thought, as she turned to go into supper. "I must try to see her again soon, for who knows what mad ideas a girl of only 15 may take into her head." End of Chapter 9. Read by Sibella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Of Barbara and Brittany by E. A. Gillie. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 10. The American Pretender. "An invitation has come from Monsieur Dubois to visit them at Dole," Mademoiselle Thérèse exclaimed with pride, on opening her letters one morning. "It is really particularly kind and nice of him. He includes you," he added, turning to Barbara. The girl had to think a few moments before remembering that Monsieur Dubois was the family friend for whose sake the sisters had sunk their grievances, and then she was genuinely pleased at the invitation. "Now, which of us shall go?" Mademoiselle proceeded. "It is clear we cannot all do so," and she looked inquiringly at her sister. "Marie and I are much too busy to accept invitations right and left like that," Mademoiselle Loiré replied loftily. "For people like you and Mademoiselle Barbara, who have plenty of leisure, it will be a very suitable excursion, I imagine." Barbara looked a little anxiously at the younger sister, fearing she might be stirred up to wrath by the veiled slur on her character, but probably she was pleased enough to be the one to go, whatever excuse Mademoiselle Loiré chose to give. Indeed, her mood had been wonderfully amicable for several days. "Let me see," she said, looking meditatively at Barbara. "You have been longing to ride something ever since you came here, and since you have not been able to find a horse, how would it do to hire a bicycle, and come only so far in the train with me and ride the rest of the way?" Barbara's eyes shone. This was a concession on Mademoiselle Thérèse's part, for she had hitherto apparently been most unwilling for the girl to be out of her sight for any length of time, and had assured her that there was no possibility of getting riding lessons in the neighbourhood. What had brought her to make this proposal now Barbara could not imagine. "That would be a perfectly lovely plan," she cried. "You are an angel to think of it, mademoiselle." At which remark the lady in question was much flattered. The next morning they started in gay spirits. Mademoiselle Thérèse arrayed in her best, which always produced a feeling of wonderment in Barbara. The lady certainly had not a Frenchwoman's usual taste, and her choice of colours was not always happy, though she herself was blissfully content about her appearance. "I'm glad you put on that pretty watch and chain," she said approvingly to her companion, when they were in the train. "I always try to make an impression when I go to Dole, for Madame Dubois is a very fashionable lady." She stroked down her mauve skirt complacently, and Barbara thought that she could not fail to make an impression of some kind. She was entertained as they went along by stories about the cleverness and position of the lawyer, and the charms of his wife, and the delights of his daughter, till Barbara felt quite nervous at the idea of meeting such an amount of goodness, fashion, and wit in its own house. Mademoiselle Thérèse allowed herself just a little time to give directions as to the route the girl was to take on leaving her, and Barbara repeated the turnings she had to make again and again till there seemed no possibility of making a mistake. "After the first short distance you reach the high road," mademoiselle called after her as she left the carriage, "so I have no fear about allowing you to go. It is a well-trodden high road, too, and not many kilometres." "I shall be all right, thank you," Barbara said gleefully, thinking how nice it was to escape into the fresh, sunny air after the close third-class carriage. "There is no sea to catch me this time, you know." Mademoiselle shook her finger at her. "Naughty, naughty, to remind me of that terrible time. It almost makes me fear to let you go." At which Barbara mounted hastily, in case she should be called back, although the train had begun to move. "Repeat your directions," her companion shrieked after her, and the girl with a laugh murmured to herself, "Turn to the right, then the left, by a large house, through a narrow lane, and voila, the high road." She had no doubt at all about knowing them perfectly. Unfortunately for her calculations, when she came to the turning point there were two lanes leading off right and left, and on this point Mademoiselle Thérèse had given her no instructions. There was nobody near to ask. So, after considering them both, she decided to take the one that looked the widest. After all, if it were wrong, she could easily turn back. She had gone but a little way, however, when she saw another cyclist approaching, and thinking that here was a chance to find out if she were right before going any farther, she jumped off her machine and stood waiting. When the newcomer was quite close to her she noticed that he was not a very prepossessing individual, and remembered that she had been warned in foreign countries always to look at people before speaking to them. But it was too late then. So, making the best of it, she asked boldly which was the nearest way to Dole. The man stared at her for a moment, then said she should go straight on, and would soon arrive at the high road. "But I will conduct you so far if you like, madame," he added. Barbara had seen him looking rather intently at her watch and chain, however, and began to feel a little uneasy. "Oh, no, thank you," she rejoined hastily. "I can manage very well myself," and springing on to her bicycle, set off at a good speed. He stood in the road for a few minutes as if meditating, but when she looked back at the corner, she saw that he had mounted too, and was coming down the road after her. There might be no harm in that, but it did not add to her happiness, and the watch and chain, which had been Aunt Anne's last gift to her, seemed to weigh heavily upon her neck. There was no thought now of turning, but, though she pedalled her hardest, she could not see any signs of a high road in front of her, and was sure she must have taken the wrong lane. Indeed, to her dismay, when she got a little farther down the road, it narrowed still more and ran through a wood. She was quite sure now that the man was chasing her, and wondered if she would ever get to Dole at all. It seemed her fate to be chased by something on her excursions, and she was not quite sure whether she preferred escaping on her own feet or a bicycle. At first he did not gain upon her much, and if she had had her own machine, and had been in good training, perhaps she might have outdistanced him, but there did not appear to be much chance of that at present. She was thankful to see a sharp descent in front of her, and let herself go at a breakneck speed, but unfortunately there was an equally steep hill to climb on the other side, and she would have to get off and walk. She was just making up her mind to turn round and brave it out, and keep her watch, if possible, when she saw something on the grass by the roadside, a little ahead of her, that made her heart leap with relief and pleasure, namely, a puff of smoke, and a figure clad in a brown tweed suit. She was sure, even after a more hurried glance, that the owner of the suit must be English, for it bore the stamp of an English tailor, and the breeze bore her unmistakable whiffs of Harris. She did not wait a moment, but leaped from her bicycle and sank down panting on the grass near, alarming the stranger, who had been nearly asleep, considerably. He jerked himself into a sitting position, and burned himself with his cigarette. "Who the dickens—" he began, then hastily took off his cap and begged the girl's pardon, to which she could not reply for breathlessness. But he seemed to understand what was needed at once, for after a swift glance from her to the man who was close at hand, he said in loud, cheerful tones, "Ah, here you are at last. I am glad you caught me up. We'll just have a little rest, then go calmly on our way. You should not ride so quickly on a hot day." The man was abreast of them now, and looked very hard at both as he passed, but did not stop, and Barbara heaved a long sigh of relief. "I'm so very sorry," she said at last. "Please understand that I'm not in the habit of leaping down beside people like that, only I've had this watch and chain such a very short time, and I was so afraid he'd take them." "And how do you know that they will be any safer with me?" he asked, with a wicked twinkle in his eyes. "Because I saw you were an Englishman, of course," she rejoined calmly. The young man laughed. "Pardon me, you are wrong, for I am an American." Barbara's cheeks could hardly grow more flushed, but she felt uncomfortably hot. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, getting up hurriedly. "I really thought it was an Englishman, and felt—at home, you know." "Please continue to think so if it makes you any happier, and I think you had better stay a little longer before going on. The fellow might be waiting farther down the road." Barbara subsided again. She had no desire to have any further encounter with the French cyclist. Meanwhile the stranger had taken one or two rapid glances at her, and the surprise on his face grew. "Where are the rest of the party?" he asked presently. "The rest of the party has gone on by train," and Barbara laughed. "Poor party! It would be so horribly alarmed if it could see me now. I always seem to be alarming it." "I don't wonder, if it is as careless as on the present occasion. Whatever possessed he, she, or it to let you come along by yourself like this? It was most culpably careless." "Oh, no, indeed. It is what I have been begging for since I came to Brittany. Indeed it is. She gave me most careful directions as to what turnings to take, and Barbara repeated them merrily. It was only that I was silly enough to take the wrong one. And now I really must be getting on, or poor Mademoiselle Thérèse will be distracted. Please, does this road lead to Dol?" "Dol?" he repeated quickly. "Yes, certainly. I am just going there, and intend to pass the night in the place. I'm on a walking tour, and—if you don't mind walking, I know there's a short cut that would be almost as quick as cycling. The high road is a good distance off yet." Barbara hesitated. The fear of meeting any more tramps was strong upon her, and her present companion had a frank, honest face, and steady grey eyes. "I don't want Mademoiselle Thérèse to be frightened by being any later than necessary," she said, doubtfully. "I really think that this will be as quick as the other road, if you will trust me," he returned, and Barbara yielded. It certainly was a very pretty way, leading across the fields and through a beech wood, and they managed to lift the bicycle over the gates without any difficulty. The girl was a little surprised by the unerring manner in which her companion seemed to go forward without even once consulting a map, but when she complimented him on the fact he looked a little uncomfortable, and assured her that he had an excellent head for direction. It was very nice meeting someone who was almost an Englishman, and they talked gaily all the time, till the square tower of Dol Cathedral came into view, one of the grandest, her guide assured her, that he had seen in Brittany. They had just entered the outskirts of the town when they passed a little auberge, where the innkeeper was standing at the door. He stared very hard at them, then lifted his hat, and cried with surprise, "Back again, monsieur! Why, I thought you were half-way to St. Malo by this time." Then the truth struck Barbara in a flash, and she had only to look at her companion's face to know she was right. "You were going the other way!" she cried. "Of course you were! And you turned back on my account. No wonder you knew your way through the wood." He gave an embarrassed laugh. "I'm sorry. I really did not mean to deceive you exactly. I have a good head for direction. And you came all that long way back with me. It was really good of you. I really—" But he interrupted her. "Please don't give me thanks when I don't deserve them. This town is such a quaint old place I am quite glad to spend the night here. And I really think you ought not to go hither and thither without the rest of the party. I don't think your aunt would like it. The house you want is straight ahead." Then he took off his cap and turned away, and Barbara never remembered, until he had gone, that though he had seen her name on the label on her bicycle, she did not know his. She christened him, therefore, the American Pretender, firstly, because he looked like an Englishman, and secondly, because he pretended to be going where he was not. After all, she was not very much behind her time, and fortunately Mademoiselle Thérèse had been so interested in the lawyer's conversation that she had not worried about her. Barbara did not speak of her encounter with the cyclist, but merely said that she had got out of her way a little, and had found a kind American who helped her to find it, which explanation quite satisfied the party. The lawyer's château, as it was called, seemed to Barbara to be very like what French houses must have been long ago, and she imagined grand ladies of the Empire time sweeping up the long flights of steps to the terrace, and across the polished floors. The salon, with its thick terra-cotta paper, and gilded chairs set in stiff rows along the walls, fascinated her too, and she half expected the lady of the house to come in, clad in heavy brocade of ancient pattern. But everything about the lady of the house was very modern, and Barbara thought Mademoiselle Thérèse's garments had never looked so ugly. The girl enjoyed sitting down to a meal which was really well served, and she found that the lawyer, though clever, was by no means alarming, and that his wife made a very charming hostess. Mademoiselle Thérèse was radiating pride and triumph at having been able to introduce her charge into such a distinguished family, and as each dish was brought upon the table, she shot a glance across at Barbara as much to say, "See what we can do! These are my friends!" Poor Mademoiselle Thérèse! After all, when she enjoyed such things so much, it was a pity, Barbara thought, that she could not have them at home. She was enjoying, too, discussing various matters with the lawyer, for discussion was to her like the very breath of life. "She will discuss with the cat if there was no one else near by," her sister had once said dryly, "and will argue with Death when he comes to fetch her." At present the topic was books, and Barbara and Madame Dubois sat quietly by, listening. "I am not learned," Madame whispered to the girl, with a little shrug, "and I know that nothing she can say will shake my husband's opinion. Therefore I let her speak." Mademoiselle was very anxious that his little girl should go to school, and was pointing out the advantages of such education to the lawyer. The latter smiled incredulously. "Would you have me send her to the convent school, where they use the same knife and fork all the week round, and wash them only once a week?" he asked contemptuously. "No," Mademoiselle agreed. "As you know, Marie used to be there, and she learned very little, nothing much except to sew. No, I would not send her to the convent school. But there are others. A young English friend of mine now. Mademoiselle Barbara knows her too. She is at a very select establishment, just about 6 girls, and so well watched and cared for." Barbara looked up quickly. She wondered if she dared interrupt and say she did not think it was such an ideal place, when the lawyer spoke before her. "Parbleu!" he said with a laugh, "I should prefer the convent. There at least the religion is honest. But with those ladies you mention, there is deceit. They pretend to be what they are not." "Oh, but no!" Mademoiselle exclaimed. "Why, they are Protestants." The lawyer shrugged his shoulders. "Believe it if you will, my dear friend, but we lawyers know most things, and I know that what I say is true. When my little Hélène goes to school, she shall not go to such. Meanwhile, I am content to keep her at home." "So am I," muttered Madame Dubois. "Schools are such vulgar places, are they not?" But Barbara, to whom the remark was addressed, was too much interested in this last piece of news to do more than answer shortly. For if what the lawyer said were true, and he did not seem like a man likely to make mistakes, then Alice Meynell might really have sufficient cause to be miserable, and Barbara wondered when she would see her again, which was to be sooner than she expected. End of Chapter 10. Read by Sibella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.